Hello and welcome to episode 2 of Creative Wordsmithing, where we're going to teach you how to write like Chuck Palahniuk. Oh, you know who Chuck Palahniuk is.
The author of these fine books.
I thought studying a specific author would be a great way to learn how creative writers can use linguistics. Alright, now before we get started, let's get one thing clear. We're going to have to talk to my lawyer. International copyright law allows for materials to be copied for academic purposes. By the way, if you're wondering what I keep below this camera frame, it's a fat, hairy dog. And she does not like my lawyer. So today I'm going to be looking at the first chapters of 6 Chuck Palahniuk books to show you how he writes.
I scanned the pages of the first chapters of 6 Chuck Palahniuk books, those specific titles being Lullaby, Diary, Invisible Monsters, Fight Club, Survivor, and Joke.
Then what I did was I took my PDF scans and I loaded them into something called OCR software. OCR software is fancy stuff. Basically what it does is it takes the PDF words and it puts them into actual text words in a document that you can edit and process. Then I took that text and I put it into AntConc. AntConc is special software that allows you to statistically analyze text and compare it against another written sample. In this particular case, I took my 6 Chuck Palahniuk samples and I compared them against samples published in the public domain, Jungle Book and Alice in Wonderland. I also compared it against a database of transcribed conversations and lectures. And here's what I found.
Today's video capture is brought to you by Seinfeld Kramer Technologies.
One of the first things I should mention is that all of the Palahniuk samples were written in first person. And they were also written in present tense. This seems to be the basis of his style. Okay, so the first significant thing I found was that the second person pronoun you was ranked as the 6th most used word, with a frequency of 199. I'll explain why this is important later on, but no words like were found. Those are hesitators. Looking at statistics of words that came up again and again, there were some really violent and some sensitive words. Words like burn, love, feel, blow, drop, scream, gun. So what happens when I take these Palahniuk samples and I compare them against the spoken samples? You had a very high negative keyness. Now what does negative keyness mean? Well, that's the software's way of telling you that they were very similar. The Palahniuk samples and the spoken samples both use the word you a lot. Now what happens when I compare the Palahniuk samples against the written samples? Now remember, I was comparing the Palahniuk samples against Jungle Book and Alice in Wonderland. Those are pretty classic. When I did that, the software told me you had a very high keyness. That means that you occurred an extremely high number of times when compared to classic literature. Okay, now that's all great and super technical, but let's try to zoom out a little bit here. Let's try to look at stuff not in terms of hard numbers. One of the first commonalities that I was able to discover in the Palahniuk samples was that all plots contain sensational violent elements. All samples began with a major plot event already in progress. All combined sensational, violent, or unsavory elements with more private personal conflicts. Alright, so those are some pretty general commonalities about the first chapters of all those Chuck Palahniuk books. But what if we try to break down how to actually write that first chapter? What specific steps is he taking throughout each of those first chapters? Well, here I'm going to refer to the specific steps as moves. And move 1 consisted of hooking the reader with a surprising statement that hinted at a damaging event. Okay, here's an example. In Fight Club, it begins with the line, "Tyler gets me a job as a waiter." After that, Tyler's pushing the gun in my mouth and saying, "The first step to eternal life is you have to die." Here, the narrator informed the reader that something violent and exciting was already happening, although it was unapparent why or how these events came to be. Okay, so here we have move 2. Move 2, the confusing events the reader was introduced to in the first move were never explained, but explored. Okay, for example, Fight Club initiated move 2 with descriptions of office equipment being thrown out of the windows of a skyscraper, references to a ticking bomb somewhere, and thin details of a love triangle between the main character, the man with the gun, and a woman. These descriptions aim to leave readers fully immersed in a confusing set of circumstances without offering any explanation. And then finally we have Move 3. Move 3 sought to end the first chapter with another hook. This was often achieved by the end of the first chapter, implying that there would be answers to the reader's questions in the coming chapters, and or returning to a sensational, violent event. So here's an example from Invisible Monsters. Invisible Monsters ended its first chapter with, "So me, I'm here eating smoke just to document this Brandy Alexander moment." The main character reminded the reader that the house was burning down and promised to document what happened, implying that the following pages will clarify the confusing events in the first chapter. Okay, so those were the moves, how the plot is sort of constructed in the first chapter. Now let's take a look at his actual writing tone. Well, this is pretty obvious. The tone of the Palahniuk samples was found to be pervasively apathetic. In the face of violent plot elements, the main characters consistently responded with an uncaring attitude. Okay, what about grammar? Did we find any grammar abnormalities that were consistent across all 6 samples? You betcha! There was a pervasive use of fragmented sentences in the Palahniuk writing samples. Sentences like this one from Invisible Monsters. And this new owner on the phone is not what our hero Helen Hoover Boyle needs this morning, this stammering and whining. You see how stammering and whining is its own sentence? This should be a comma. Now here's something else super interesting I found. It's not grammar, but it is formatting. Check this out. Chuck Palahniuk very frequently puts paragraph breaks for short sentences to sort of set them apart. You do the little job you're trained to do. Paragraph break. Pull a lever. Paragraph break. Push a button. Paragraph break. Okay, so what happens when you try to put all of these elements together? Well, it seems that the Palahniuk writing samples appear to be emulating spoken English while still possessing the careful craft of prose. Present tense verbs, high use of second-person pronouns, and a lack of hesitators. All of the Palahniuk samples contain violent or exciting elements to snag the reader's attention. Reader curiosity is further promoted by the apathy present in the characters in the face of mortal danger. Now, an audience likes to read a book to see what comes next and to understand why things happen. So, the move structure of Palahniuk's first chapters is not surprising. It is completely designed to hook and not let go. One might argue that the apathetic tone combined with the violent plot elements already present in the samples seems to create a perfect harmony between pleasing both critical and non-critical readers. Now, what do I base this on? Well, Kuntz 1981 stated that plotting is a chore from which the academically oriented novelist is freed. He does not need to worry about pace, about filling his story with action. The university-trained critic disdains action. It is said to be the tool of hacks. He continues on to claim that the so-called literary novels seldom have heroines or heroes. The characters in such fiction are nearly always weak, flawed, and often downright unlikable. The Palahniuk samples contain both action and unlikable, flawed, and apathetic characters. Perhaps this is why Palahniuk's books appeal to such a wide base of readers. They can be stimulating on both an academic and unacademic level. So there you have it. You put enough of those pieces together, you'll come up with something that sounds a lot like what Chuck Palahniuk writes. Now next week, what I would like to do is kind of break down how I did this with Chuck Palahniuk's writing. I mean, the statistical stuff is just putting this in a program, but there are finer points that you really need to keep in mind when you're looking at text.
Wave bye-bye to the fat dog.